This is Dr. Erich Fromm, one of the most influential psychoanalysts in the world. A man whose work has been hailed as a significant step forward from the theories of Sigmund Freud. Recently, Dr. Fromm said, "There has never been a better society than in the United States in 1958. But he added, if the United States goes on in the direction it is now taking, it is in serious danger of destroying itself. We'll find out why in a moment.
The Mike Wallace interview, presented by the American Broadcasting Company in association with the Fund for the Republic, brings you a special television series discussing the problems of survival and freedom in America.
Good evening, I'm Mike Wallace. In recent weeks, we've been discussing the problems of a free society and what it must do to survive. Tonight, we'll try to measure the impact of our free society on us as individuals, whether we're as happy as we like to think we are, or as free to think and to feel. Our guest is Dr. Erich Fromm, a psychoanalyst and social critic who is internationally renowned for his studies of men and their search for freedom. Dr. Fromm, first let me ask you this. From many different quarters, the United States, I think you will agree, has been criticized as a materialistic society, perhaps even a shallow society. Yet only recently you said this. You said there has never been a better society than in the United States in 1958. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean it, of course, in relative terms. The history of man so far is nothing to brag about from the standpoint of our ideals. And what I mean is that in comparison with most other societies, our present-day American society has achieved things which are remarkable. Material wealth greater than for any other nation, a relative freedom from oppression, a relative mobility, spreading of art, of music, of thought, which is also rather unique. So I would say compared with the 19th century, compared with most previous history, this is as good or better society than any which man has ever made. But that doesn't mean it is such a good one.
Well, that's the point. At the same time, you make this apparently contradictory statement, because you also said earlier this week, if the United States goes on in the direction it is taking, it is in serious danger of destroying itself. Now, how? In what ways?
Well, Mr. Wallace, I would say, if I would put it generally, because in our enthusiasm to dominate nature and to produce more material goods, we have transformed means into ends. We wanted to produce more in the 19th century and the 20th century in order to give man the possibility for a more dignified human life. But actually what has happened is that production and consumption have ceased to be means and have become ends. And we are production crazy and consumption crazy.
Well, I would like to get your views, with that as a background, I'd like to get your views as a psychoanalyst on specific instances, on what is happening to us as individuals. For instance, what would you say is happening to man, American man, in relationship to his work?
I think his work is to a large extent meaningless, because he is not related to it. He is increasingly part of a big machinery, social machinery, governed by a big bureaucracy. And I think American man unconsciously hates his work very often because he feels trapped by it, imprisoned by it, because he feels that he's spending most of his energy for something which has no meaning in itself.
By meaning in itself, he uses his work to make a living. Certainly
yes.
That is dignified, sensible, and necessary.
Yes, but that is not quite enough to make one happy if one spends 8 hours a day in something which in itself has no meaning and interest except that one gains money from it.
Well, by meaning and interest in work, maybe I'm pressing this unnecessarily hard. What specifically do you mean? When a man works at a factory with a monkey wrench, let us say, what meaning, what deeper meaning are you looking for?
Well, there is a creative pleasure which, for instance, the artisan in the Middle Ages or in a country like Mexico still today has, namely the pleasure of creating something. Now, you find quite a few skilled workers who still have that pleasure. maybe in a steel mill, maybe a worker who works with a complicated machine. He has a sense that he's creating something. But if you take a salesman who sells a useless commodity, he feels like a fraud and he hates his commodity like something.
Mm-hmm. But you say a useless commodity. If he sells toothbrushes or automobiles,
well,
television...
useless is a relative term. For instance, if in order to make his quota, he has to make people buy things of which he knows they shouldn't buy them, then indeed, in terms of the needs of these people, they are useless, even if in themselves they are all right.
In writing about men in America, you've talked frequently about what you call the marketing orientation. What do you mean by the marketing orientation, Dr. Fromm?
I mean by that our main way of relating ourselves to others is like things relate themselves to things on the market. We want to exchange our own personality, or as one says sometimes, our personality package, for something. Now, this is not so true for the manual worker. The manual worker does not have to sell his personality. He doesn't have to sell his smile. But what you might call the symbol pushers, that is to say all the people who deal with figures, with paper, with men, who manipulate, to use a better or nicer word, manipulate men and signs and words. All those today have not only to sell their service, but in the bargain they have to sell their personality more or less. There are exceptions.
So his sense of his own value must therefore depend upon what the market, in a sense, is willing to pay for him.
Exactly. Just as a handbag which cannot be sold because there is not enough demand is economically speaking useless. And if the handbag could think, it would have a terrific inferiority feeling, because not having been bought, it would feel useless. So does a man who considers himself as a thing, and if he's not successful to sell himself, he feels he is a failure.
All right, let's move to our social relationships, in our feelings toward our neighbors, toward our friends. What's happening to man in those spheres?
Well, in the first place, I would say our social relationships are relatively shallow. We are actually afraid to be intimate with people. Many people even with their wives and husbands. And we substitute, or we rather hide this fear of real intimacy by a superficial kind of friendliness, which is quite nice, but nevertheless very shallow. But I think there is another answer to your question, which I should like to give. Actually, if you take the average American, and studies have shown that, he is really concerned only with private affairs, that is to say, with his health, his money, and family affairs. He is not concerned with his society. He talks about it. But, you know, if one speaks of being concerned, I mean something about which one loses one's sleep sometimes. Mm-hmm. And the average American never loses his sleep about affairs which relate to his society and to our whole country. That is to say, I mean, he has separated his private life from his existence as a member of his society and leaves that to the specialists of the government to take care of.
Do you think that that is happening to American man? And of course we're speaking not only of American man, but American woman as well here, Dr. Fromm, in relationship to his politics, to his political beliefs?
Yes, indeed. We have in the same way relegated our own responsibility in what happens to our country to the specialists who are supposed to take care of it, and the individual citizen does not feel that he can judge and even that he should judge and take any responsibility. I think there are quite a number of recent developments which show that.
Like for instance?
Like for instance, that we are confronted with the possibility of a war of such destruction that the whole existence of our nation and of the whole world is at stake. And yet, people know it. People read it in the newspaper. People read that at the first attack, 100 million Americans might be killed. And yet, they talk about it as if they were talking about something being wrong with their carburetor of their car, perhaps. Actually, they have paid more attention to the danger of a flu epidemic than to the danger of the atomic bomb. Because...
Don't you think that's a little overstatement, Dr. Fromm?
Well, I wished it were, because what I see is relatively few people who experience, who feel the danger which we are threatened with, and who feel the responsibility of doing something about it.
Well, maybe when you talk about the responsibility of doing something, maybe it simply is this, that we find it very difficult to make ourselves felt in this amorphous society in which we live. Each individual would want to do something, but would find it difficult to make himself felt.
Well, I think here you point out to one, really, of the basic defects of our system, that the individual citizen has very little possibility of having any influence, of making his opinion felt in the decision-making. And I think that in itself leads to a good deal of political lethargy and stupidity. It is true that one has to think first and then to act. But it's also true that if one has no possibility of acting, one thinking kind of becomes empty and stupid.
Let's talk about the man in relation to his love, his marriage.
Well, I would say love is something everybody talks about, and the need for love is one of the most basic needs of man, namely the experience of union with another being, of becoming one with another being. And yet I would say that love today is a relatively rare phenomenon, that we have a great deal of sentimentality, we have a great deal of illusion about love, namely as something one falls in, but the question is that one cannot fall in love really. One has to be in love, and that means that loving becomes, and the ability to love, becomes one of the most important things in life.
Why is it so difficult for us to be in love as human beings? What is wrong with us, as you see it?
Because we are concerned with things, we are concerned with success, we are concerned with money, we are concerned with instrumentalities. And the most important things we talk about on Sundays are things to which we pay very little attention. Love is not easy. All great religions postulate love as one of the greatest accomplishments. If it were that easy, or as easy as most people think, certainly the great religious leaders would have been rather naive.
Well, you mentioned what we think about, or what we talk about anyway on Sundays. What about man in relationship to his religion?
Well, I think here we find the same phenomenon. We have a religious renaissance today in America,
yes,
as many people say. I would say this religious renaissance, 90% of it is the greatest danger true religious experience has ever been confronted with.
Why?
Because what is attempted in this so-called religious renaissance is kind of a mixture between Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Be Successful, and the norms of the Bible, of the Old and the New Testament, and in a kind of clever and sometimes not so clever way. People try to combine the two. Well, that is actually very much the contrary of the spirit of our true religious tradition. I could put it in another way, Mr. Wallace. I could say this. Men today, being concerned with production and consumption as ends in themselves, has very little energy, time to devote himself to the true religious experience. So
when you say the true religious experience, what do you mean by that, Doctor?
I mean by that the capacity to feel deep love, deep oneness with my fellow man, with nature, and if I were religious in the conventional sense, I would say with God. But it doesn't matter whether one uses God or doesn't. What matters is which experience a person has.
The picture that you draw is of a society, and we're talking now basically of Western society, of American society. The picture that you draw is a very dismal one. Now, one of our main concerns, let me differentiate. Of course, our main concern as human beings, certainly in this part of the world, is to survive and to stay free and to realize ourselves. How does all that you've said affect our ability to survive and to stay free in this world that is now in crisis?